Right, so we're continuing. So we have this idea then, basically, that how things are seen and understood, what is taken to be true, can vary between different communities, and that ultimately points to fairly, sort of deeply embedded so-called procedures of justification, or just how it is that it's gone about. So a key thing about this, of course, is that things can be very different. Now, in the world today, there's not so much of this. Generally, the tendency of globalization is toward a kind of homogeneity, but there are still important differences. And you could just imagine cases like this. I mean, in countries like ours, many sorts of questions, right, are indeed settled by way of empirical science. That is to say, that is what is taken as the right way of justifying the claims that we make or what we take to be true. You can contrast that in different ways. You can think about very small, say, religious communities, even within countries like this, who might justify things rather differently on the basis of some sort of religious doctrine, for example. You can imagine dictatorships, for example, where justification goes by way of, well, in effect, what does the government say? What does the Ministry of Information say? And so, you could have things that from different perspectives seem quite insane, basically. People can think that people living in other communities have been brainwashed or are kind of dim-witted or something. None of that needs to be true. It's just that different communities, do things differently. That includes coming up with an understanding of reality and how they take things to be true. And the most important thing is that in each case, it works, right? It makes sense to have sort of authoritarian justification in a dictatorship, for example, that actually works, right, to maintain the community as it is, right, in that form. It may not be a good thing. People on the outside can certainly be of that view, that they don't think it's a good thing, that they themselves wouldn't want to move there, but it typically works both ways, actually. And in general, if you did want to undermine a certain community, this is what you would target. And this often happens when you're talking about sort of ideology or propaganda, for example. People who live in very traditional religious communities probably know this very well, right? That they actually do need to kind of insulate people, just as, say, dictatorships do too, from other ways of seeing, because they know that once that question gets opened up, once people start to think that you could actually justify things differently, that you could take different things to be true, then what holds a certain community together and gives it its kind of integrity and cohesiveness would be destroyed. So, basically he wants to say, he says a bunch of things. The next few slides are not too different, right? He's saying, well, he's just describing things, how it is humans basically go about making sense of things, and it always points back to basically the good of the community, what works for the community as that context within which individuals are who they are, become who they are, and have the lives that they have, basically. It always provides that context. It's a very important thing. Rorty doesn't explicitly say in this particular text, but that basically humans, in his view, are not, isolated creatures. We are inherently social, right? We always are members of some community, and that community basically kind of provides the ground, or if you like the metaphor, the kind of the soil within which individuals grow. Without that, they're nothing. So it's really crucial, he thinks, that, truth basically is oriented toward the well-being, the strength, the vibrancy of different communities, whatever they may be and however they may appear to outsiders. So there's a good little summary statement, basically. He says, when we're thinking about making sense of things, gaining knowledge, it's always ethical. So ethical here in a broad sense, having to do with like the strength of our relationships within that community, right? It's like keeping the fabric strong. It's not an abstract or merely theoretical question, but always points back to kind of the well-being or the good of the community. So basically, then we have the question set up, right? So in a sense, he hasn't answered the question yet, right? All solidarity or objectivity. He's basically laid out both kind of options and sort of leveled the playing field. He's made it a real question. Typically, there's no real question. People automatically assume objectivity must be right, solidarity must be wrong. He's just trying to make it a fair thing by showing, with that criterion argument, that in effect everything's on the same level theoretically. There's no theoretical answer to this question, right? People want there to be. It would be so much easier if there were an objectively true answer to the question about this, but of course there's not. That's one of the options on the table. So he's thinking, how do we ultimately answer this, basically? And he's going to say, he wants to go in the direction of talking about solidarity, and he wants to kind of ease our worries. He can say, yes, even if we live in a time and a place where we have focused on the ideal of objectivity, we can still kind of largely do things in the same way, but we're just going to do it with a greater self-consciousness now. Again, this is a lot like Hume. He says, don't stop engaging in empirical reasoning, but just be more clearly aware of what you're doing when you're doing it. So here he'd say, just people should not, they can pursue knowledge in the same ways. They can still like science. Rorty's not against science, but he wants us to realize that the way we regard it or the value that we attach to it is just our own ethnocentric view, and we cannot ultimately say, prove that it is the right way. It just works for us. And we might recommend it to others, but it's ultimately up to them, I suppose, to decide. But just basically to stop kind of assuming that somehow we've clued into what is absolutely true, rather than just seeing that, this particular kind of approach works well for us. That's what we should say. That's kind of an option. It's still not answering the question, though. Right? The question really can be put, whether or not that is still the right way to go. Does that really work for us? That's actually the question he's heading towards, whether or not thinking about it in terms of that ideal of objectivity, or at least the kinds of things that we've taken toward that ideal, right, where we basically, don't follow kind of our more traditional assumptions and ideas, where we try to turn away from them rather than basically more espousing or, say, embracing them more explicitly. Which he has, I just point out this little phrase at the bottom here, criterionless muddling through. He's saying that's kind of what we actually do. Right? That is to say, we don't have a criterion of truth. We muddle through in the sense that we figure things out. We're faced with problems and challenges. We work out answers that work well for us. They may not work for others. So that's fine. And we should just embrace that and see that that is, in fact, the situation we're in. And if we see it that way, he thinks we'll be much more at ease with the solidarity idea. The worries, he thinks, some of the things he briefly talks about, is just that basically, if we're thinking that it would make us tolerant of things that we shouldn't be tolerant of, there is that worry. That is a possibility, basically. There is a certain kind of live and let live message here in a certain way, right? And some people find that hard to swallow, but he thinks, the bigger problem is quite likely when certain people or certain communities are so convinced that they have the absolute truth, they become extremely intolerant, and that's not very bad. None of these problems are generated by Rorty. He doesn't make them up, but maybe he can help us see more clearly that those are always the terms that we have to deal with. So basically he does want to go this way, the ethnocentric or the solidarity route. I think we should just embrace our ethnocentric perspective. There are problems, we have to lose some ideas that we might have attached a great value to about being part of some larger universal humanity, whatever. He thinks it just doesn't hold up. We're probably better off giving that up. There's certain kinds of comfort, basically, in some larger ideas, but those basically will drop away. And ultimately, let's see, what slide am I on here? This is the last one. Basically, what really clinches it for him, what really seals it ultimately, again, it's not a theoretical argument. It cannot be. There is no such argument to be made. It has to be on practical terms. The question really is, what would work better? And so we kind of ask, it's a huge question, but you can try to just think about it, whether or not a focus on the ideal of objectivity actually has worked in the sense of making our lives better. Are people really happier than, say, they used to be in the past? Does it actually work? He wants to suggest no. And the basic reason for this is that it just explicitly turns our attention in the wrong way. It basically detaches our quest for knowledge from the well-being of the community that sustains our life, basically. He thinks we should put those back together. In a certain sense, they've never really been separated, but we've gotten confused, and we're kind of working at cross purposes when we pursue so-called objective knowledge. It doesn't sort of feed back into and strengthen our community. Objective knowledge is completely indifferent to our well-being. But what's the point of pursuing knowledge? The point, after all, is for our good, isn't it? So it should be tied to the well-being of our communities, he thinks. It just makes sense. And so that's what he thinks ultimately is the reason. The word nihilism that he invokes at some point is kind of like the loss of meaning or meaningfulness. And that's basically what he thinks has been going on for some time. The more we develop knowledge in ways that are completely divorced from our actual, more concrete sense of well-being, right? The strength of our community, which is the source of meaningfulness in our lives. We're working at cross purposes like this. Of course it's going to turn out badly. He can say, sure, we got lots of gadgets and whatever, and, science clearly brings good things when pursued objectively. And he thinks none of that has to change, right? We should just recognize that it has worked to the extent that it has, only because, it has been sort of our ethnocentric perspective. So we should just make that more explicit, just embrace that more directly, and then things could be even better, probably, right? It's just the idea that it makes sense to see things going better when we more directly connect our pursuit of knowledge and how we make sense of things with the well-being of our communities. So ultimately, it's a practical justification which just has to be. So in that sense, again, it's a lot like Hume, right? Hume said, look, of course, empirical reason, you can't exactly prove that it is the best way to go, but gosh, it works so well. That's why we keep doing it. And it's kind of the same thing here, more or less. There's always some room for change, right? Nothing is actually ever perfectly carved in stone. Everything can evolve and develop historically, of course, but he just thinks that each different human community is always going to be better off when it sort of sees things in this way, kind of prioritizes its own well-being when it's thinking about questions of truth and knowledge and how it makes sense of things. So give that a think. And what we're going to do next time, talk about the next piece from Sandra Harding, which basically does something, well, it's similar in some ways. It's along the same lines, goes a little bit further, but then has a very different conclusion, tries to go in a very different way, tries to actually rethink objectivity. So we're going to talk a little bit more about rorty when we explore that contrast.